Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about the 4B movement discussed by Angela Miller and Angela Wild and Elizabeth Miller. So welcome and over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's great to be back here doing another presentation with Angela. And we're going to discuss the 4B movement in South Korea, where it got started, and also how it has spread to other places in the world, and also a bit about reactions to the movement. So next slide, please. So there are going to be 4 parts to our presentation. I'm going to begin by speaking about the 4B movement in South Korea. Then Angela will talk about the 4B movement and how it spread to Western countries. Then I'll talk about some reaction and backlash by men and by society more generally to the 4B movement. And then Angela will finish by talking about historical female separatist movements. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh. So here's a little bit of background about South Korea and why it was a good environment or a likely environment for the 4B movement to arise. And I'll explain in a little while what 4B stands for. It's 4 different words in the Korean language that women have decided to refuse to do, but we'll talk more about that. So as of 2023, South Korea was 105th out of 146 countries in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, which evaluates gender-based gaps in education, welfare, employment, and political power. And so this is from a New York Times article about various ways that gender norms are very suffocating for women in South Korea, widespread in South Korean society. So things like being expected to be sort of a kitchen slave and a general household slave for your husband, married women being saddled with most chores and childcare, so much so that many women give up even having professional ambitions outside of the home. And even in dual income households, wives spend more than 3 hours on tasks in the home versus their husband spending less than an hour. In the workplace itself, there's a tremendous amount of discrimination against women, and especially against working mothers. And sex-based violence is extremely widespread, according to groups like Human Rights Watch. And so for example, in 2021, a woman was murdered or targeted for murder every 1.4 days or less, according to the Korea Women's Hotline. Next slide. So women in South Korea in about 2016 started to really rebel against this and start various kinds of Me Too related movements and groups like the 4B movement. So the 4B movement translates to 4 Korean words that start with B, and it's the 4 no's, 4 things that women in this movement are saying no to. So no dating, no sex, no marriage, and no child rearing. And in fact, this movement's has gotten a lot of attention both in the country and around the world, and it has led to some good results, such as abortion being decriminalized and harsher penalties for the epidemic of spy cam porn crimes that have been happening for many years in South Korea. So there's a real epidemic in South Korea of spy cam porn, where men will put spy cams in like basically every public place, including public bathrooms, and to record women when they don't know they're being recorded, and then they put that stuff on on the internet as porn, basically. And this was really women in South Korea were very, very upset about that, and that was one thing that led to the 4B movement. Next slide. So just a few more statistics about how Korean women are reacting to the very widespread sexism and misogyny in South Korea, both structurally and in their personal relationships. So a decade ago, almost 47% of single and never married Korean women said that they thought they did need to get married, that marriage was necessary. But last year that fell to 22%. And the number of couples, heterosexual couples getting married fell by several hundred thousand since 1996. So there's definitely a large shift of South Korean women just deciding not to get married. And one of the big inspirations for this movement was a 2016 feminist novel called Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which centers on a married South Korean woman who has quit her job and she's struggling to raise her child with limited support. And this was a huge hit book and continues to be among young women in South Korea. And it just recently was made into a film as well, which is also a very big hit among South Korean women. Next slide. So this book and this film really galvanized women and kind of made them much more aware that other women were also bothered by these things, and that it sort of became a movement in people's minds as instead of being seen by them as an individual personal problem. Another related movement in South Korea is the Escape the Corset movement that emerged in 2018 because South Korea has some of the strictest beauty standards in the world, where many young women not only were spending a huge amount of money on makeup, but also getting elective plastic surgery and lightening their skin to meet Western beauty standards. And this was extremely widespread and took a tremendous amount of time and money for the women. And this was in response to the fact that if they didn't do all these beauty practices, they would be heavily discriminated against based on their appearance when they were applying for jobs. So in South Korea, applicants are commonly asked for photos as well as information about their height and weight. And the Escape the Corset movement was a reaction to this. And that movement involved women deciding not to wear makeup or do beauty standards. And some of them made videos, viral videos of them cutting their hair on camera and smashing up their makeup collections, throwing away their makeup and things like that. And just as an aside, we will make these slides available later. There's a new book from 2023 that some people listening may be interested in called Flowers of Fire, The Inside Story of South Korea's Feminist Movement and What It Means for Women's Rights Worldwide. So as I said, this is a movement that started, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it's really gotten the world's attention. And now there's this book from 2023 that sort of captures the impact of this feminist movement in South Korea. Next slide. Okay, so talking a little bit more about the principles, these 4 no's, and please excuse my pronunciation. I don't speak Korean, so I'm sure I will pronounce these words incorrectly. But the 4 no's are, they each start with the word be, which means no. So bihon, bichulsan, biyone, and bisekyu. And those mean the complete refusal and renunciation or saying no to marriage, childbirth, romance, and sexual relationships with men. So just to go into a little bit more detail about those, the bihon, refusal of marriage, is an attempt to challenge the heteronormative family model in Korea. And that's something that has dropped steadily since the 1990s. So that even predated the more formal 4B movement, that the rate of marriage was going down very precipitously since the 90s. The bichulsan, refusal of childbirth aspect of the movement is a direct opposition to South Korea's governmental pro-natalist policies, which view South Korean women as basically tools for the country to be sort of reproductive engines to reproduce the country and make sure that Korea as a source of workers for its economy. And as a result of the 4B movement, South Korea's birth rate has dropped significantly, making it the nation with the lowest birth rate in the world, and subsequently raising doubts, especially in the mind of the government, about whether the movement is too extreme. Next slide. And then the Biyone and Bisexu, sorry about my pronunciation, refusal of romance and sexual relationships with men, runs even deeper than just an attack on patriarchy structurally, and is more of a call for women to individually free themselves from sexual and social oppression. And again, this is partly a reaction originally against the very widespread spy cam crisis, where cameras were being hidden in public bathrooms and motels and then shared online. And women believed that the punishments for these crimes were only a slap on the wrist and should be much harsher. And so part of refusing to be in relationships with men at all was a reaction to women whose boyfriends and husbands were filming them without their consent and sharing those films. Next slide. A lot of the women in this movement, if you listen to them speak or read their words online, say that they feel that Korean men are essentially beyond redemption, and that the only solution is to just separate from any kind of relationships with men, that they really can't sort of stay in those relationships and make the men better, that they've tried that and it just hasn't worked. And so the solution is to separate from those relationships. And again, just to mention again, a statistic from their Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, the incidence of intimate partner violence was 41.5%, which is significantly higher than the already terrible global average of 30%. And as I mentioned, this movement has had some impact on the law in South Korea. So they've won the decriminalization of abortion and also harsher penalties for the spy cam crimes. Next slide. Okay, I will send it over to Angela for part 2.
Hello, thanks Liz for this part of the presentation. I'm going to speak loud. Please let me know if it's not loud enough, as I seem to have some issues with my microphone. So in my part of the presentation, I wanted to focus on the way the Korean 4B movement has expanded, and it has actually spread in China and in the West. And in this section, I will look at the 4B movement in the West. And the first thing that struck me is the amount of media coverage that it has attracted. As you can see, it's clearly captured the Western media imagination. So I've gathered random articles that reflect various concerns. These come from a serious news outlet, from fashion magazine, and they're all discussing why the women in Korea are choosing celibacy. There's a sense of maybe a bit of worry, I think. So some fear that it can spread in the West, or it already has. There's some interesting discussion about how feminism has jumped from being sex positive to being about voluntary celibacy, which I found fascinating. And another article talks about Bumble. It's a dating app which had to apologize for mocking celibacy as a choice. Again, this could not have been possible a few years ago. Some view 4B as the death of heterosexuality, and others blame feminism for the rising rate of male suicide. So overall, I think the volume of articles that I've seen indicates that the media take 4B seriously, but at this stage, I think it's still largely perceived as a Korean movement. How has 4B entered the international scene? Well, aspects of the 4B principles have been adopted by women in the US, in Australia, in the UK, and beyond. With discussion flourishing on social media, so video-based social media, such as TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. And many Western women not only describe what's going on in Korea, but they feel inspired by it. They express their desire to join the movement. And I'm going to show you several videos which feature Western women that I've seen on TikTok explaining why they're joining 4B and why it resonates with them. I really wanted to give them the voice, that you could hear their words. Personally, I find a lot of this extremely positive. So my work here is to highlight the radical feminist principle that I see emerging from these videos, but also the potential limitation of the movement. So yeah, if I can have the next slide, please, Joe. So yes, I think it is indeed delicious. So I couldn't find concrete evidence of how much the 4B movement affect the birth rate in Korea. As Elizabeth spoke about it, I think there's many factors for big shift like this. I think Korea 4B is definitely a contributing factor. But more importantly, patriarchy is indeed very worried about this declining birth rate, not just in Korea, but globally, as it's evident because we see a lot of heavy pro-natalist propaganda. What's inspiring in this particular video and many others to me is that women are very excited. There's a recognition that our individual and collective action can create a real change. And there's also a call for action, or really a call to passive disobedience in that case. And beyond the individualistic change, I won't date men, there's a growing understanding that this has a global impact. So like, the personal is political. They don't name it like this, but I think this is where we're getting at. So what we see a lot is women's experience with men has led them to disengage from heterosexual relationship. I love this. Yes, I love this too. I think it's incredible, and the tone. And many say, I was part of the 4B movement, I didn't even know it. And it's a spontaneous movement of women recognizing that about the oppressive nature of heterosexuality. She says it on camera, I'm scared of men. And they are opting out. So I think you remember maybe this quote from German Greer: women have very little idea of how much men hate them. And I think here we have a generation of women who are totally aware of men's hatred towards women. There's no more denial. They are so aware that they are free to talk about it. They share experience about it, and they reach the natural conclusion: why would anyone want to spend time with people who hate them? And also in this video, what's great is that she turns a personal issue into a class analysis. He hates us, he hates you, they hate us. So it's becoming a sex class issue. And there's also a shift in focus. Women are encouraging each other to see, they're encouraging each other to center our energy on ourselves. They realize that if women give ourselves the attention and love that we've traditionally collectively given to men, that this attention and love that's been wasted, then, our lives can be fulfilled through our own accomplishment. This is available, to us. So the principle of women-centeredness is re-emerging greatly in these videos. I really love it. Also an interesting point, like women of all backgrounds share their knowledge, their experience about male oppression, the cheating, the prostitution, the violence, the parasitic nature of men in relationship, the way she say, oh, men stay in relationship because they benefit from it. This is now quite a widespread way to discuss heterosexual relationship online. And yeah, the exploitation of heterosexual setting. Many of these videos interact with one another, as you've seen in the previous one as well. And I think that overall what does generate is a form of digital consciousness raising. So this one goes further because women are urging each other to set emotional boundaries as well as physical ones. So it's about stopping engagement with men to preserve ourselves. She calls men vampire in a way. So realizing the parasitic nature of men's behavior, protecting our energy. And if you leave men but still engage obsessively online, you are still emotionally involved, you are still emotionally bound, and you're still available to them. So what she's doing is she's pushing the idea of separatism further, even further. So yes, wonderful. So many women are coming to terms with seeing men as they really are, not as we wish them to be. So rather than holding to romanticized notion that men are capable or even willing to treat women well, leaving men behind would allow women to see that we can find what we need from one another. And here I can see like a little sense of an emerging sense of sisterhood, of women's community, and the idea that we could provide what we need to live well, that we women are enough for each other. So this one, I think globally it shows that women in the West are addressing still this issue in two different ways. So some are really quite strictly following the Korean principle, men are beyond salvation, we're out. And others, like maybe this one is more about withdrawing from men until men behave better. And I think this video is somewhere in between. I think we can debate whether men can actually, are capable or willing to change. But the second approach is more likely to lead women to return to an oppressive heterosexual dynamic. So these two things are happening at the same time, and hopefully they are going towards a more radical route. But let's see. Next. Amazing. So the way she's seeing it is that the 4B is a backlash against men maybe being more openly misogynistic than they were before, if it's possible. At least we can see it better. And I think it's really refreshing to see a spontaneous radicalization of women driven by real life experiences, not necessarily theory. And especially, I'm saying this like I love theory, but I'm saying this in the context that what is called feminism out there, the books that maybe she would have accessed if she had searched, most likely would have been pro-sex feminism focused on letting men access women's bodies. And in fact, what we see that 4B digital consciousness raising approach leads to a more radical politic than a lot of the texts that are out there today. So the way she links that women denouncing male behavior is met with men being more threatening, more violent. It's like women react to men violence by opting out. The more they opt out, the more violent men become. We are in a vicious circle. It seems to accelerate, and it seems to be going into one direction, to more separatism from women, because men aren't going to stop being violent overnight. So I see more separation in the future. Also, the way she links the contraception issue here, I'm not in the US, but I've been wondering why women in the US have been embracing 4B visibly more than in the UK, and it might be one of the reasons, so I'll be interested to see what women think about that. So on that one, I think it's a really important insight and perspective to keep in mind. I'm also asking women to keep that in mind, as we may have to see more violence in the future. I think that maybe she doesn't anticipate how long the backlash could be going for. We'll see about that in the fourth section. But overall on this section, I'd like to say that I find personally the diversity among the women in the West engaging in that across age, ethnicity, class, very positive. It seemed to be touching women from all over. And the content of the discussion is promising for such a young movement. However, some women implying that they'd return to men if men improve kind of lacks consistency for me. I hope that they grow out of that. They will when they see that men don't change. And also, I think it needs a bit more of a woman-centered approach, like the Korean movement globally. There's the 4B, and there's also something called the 6B4T, which incorporate other things like refusing beauty standards, like supporting single women and lesbian women who support the movement. I think the Western movement is still quite an individualistic movement. It lacks a bit of offline activism. It mainly operates through online videos. Despite these limitations, I'd say that I think it's a massive improvement considering we come from sex-positive feminism era. But to become a force to be really reckoned with, I hope that embrace broader feminist principle like it did in Korea. So I'm going to leave this one here, and that's the end of part 2.
Okay, thank you, Angela. That was wonderful. I wanted to just comment on a couple of things you said. One is that I've had a similar experience as you of seeing on social media really this sort of consciousness raising group taking place across women in many countries. So it's really I mean, there's a lot of bad things about the internet and social media, but this is one really great thing, is that we can hear what women in other countries are saying much more easily than we could in past times. And women are, so as a result, the movement has had this very viral quality where women are hearing what women are doing in other countries and either saying, hey, I've been doing that too. I guess it's not just me in my little silo. I'm actually part of a movement, and that makes them even more committed to it. And it makes them feel closer to other women and a community of women, and a sort of communal consciousness raising. So that's been really great to see. And also, so sometimes they'll say, I've been doing this too, I guess I'm part of this movement. And other times they'll say, I didn't know we could do this. Like, I just ran across this TikTok of these women saying X, Y, and Z. That's such a good idea. I'm going to do that too. So that's been really wonderful to see on social media, and particularly TikTok, I've noticed, is a very big place where this is proliferating. TikTok really has a conversational quality where people respond to each other's videos and respond in comments. And so that's been really exciting. Also, the other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that one of the sisters who's here today, who's from Central Asia, was saying that this movement, of course, is also in other places in Asia, like China. It's quite big in China. This is stuff we don't really have a lot of time to talk about today, but I did want to just mention that it's also big in China. It's also big apparently in Central Asia. And there's different iterations of it with 6B, 4T, and things like that. And so those are things I'd like to know more about. And it would be great to maybe hear from women in other countries speaking about their experience with this. I want to talk a little bit about reaction by men and South Korean society and South Korean government more broadly, and also reaction by men in the West to the spread of 4B in the West. So, for example, in South Korea in 2022, there was a survey that found that 65% of women, as opposed to 48% of men, don't want children. And the women are doubling down on this by avoiding marriage completely. The other term in South Korea for a birth strike is a marriage strike. Now, this has been having impacts in South Korea that we can debate whether they're good impacts or bad impacts or neutral. But the fact is, for 3 years in a row, the country has recorded the lowest fertility rate in the world, with women of reproductive age having fewer than one child on average. And in 2020, it reached what statisticians call the dead cross, where deaths outnumber births. And that happened almost a decade earlier than had been expected. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the reaction of young Korean men, and also of the government, which in South Korea, which has had a pretty hysterical reaction. So many young South Korean men have declared themselves to be victims of women's activism, and said that they are being treated badly by women, and they're very angry about it. And in fact, President Yoon rose to power in 2022 by leveraging the resentment of young men. And he sort of echoed what men's rights activists had been saying in South Korea. It kind of reminds me of Trump echoing the anger of that we hear in society in the US. So he, when he was campaigning for president, said that structural sexism no longer exists in South Korea. And instead of sort of reacting to what women were saying by saying that there would be tougher punishments for sexual assault or domestic violence, he went in the opposite direction and said there's going to be tougher punishment for so-called false reports of sexual assault. His government is also doing things like removing the term gender equality from school textbooks, and he's canceled funding for programs to fight everyday sexism. And one lawmaker in his party was quoted as saying, if you find gender equality and feminism so important, you can do it with your own money and time. So that kind of reminds me of what Angela was talking about. Like, if you're not nice to us, we'll stop protecting you. It's kind of the government saying that. And I'm laughing because it's so absurd, but of course it's not funny at all in reality. The South Korean government is also working to dismantle its own headquarters for women's empowerment, the Gender Equality Ministry. That ministry was established in 2001, and it's been transformative in doing things like normalizing parental leave for fathers and helping more women achieve workplace seniority. But Yoon's government is planning to dismantle, or maybe they even have dismantled it by this point. This article was from 2023, so I'm not sure if it actually has been dismantled. So the data about South Korea's fertility rate is really striking. In 2023, Statistics Korea reported a rate of 0.72 fertility rate. So 72 babies for every 100 women. And this is well below population replacement level. And the South Korean government has been really hysterical about this. They're extremely upset about it. In May 2024, the president announced plans to establish a government ministry that would address the notoriously low number of births. And some of this is good. I mean, they're kind of holding out carrots to try to get women to have babies. And some of the things that they've offered are boosting parental leave allowances, lengthening time off available for fathers, instituting flexible employment schedules, and lightening the educational hardship on parents. So, I mean, some of those things are good, but they're doing them only to encourage women to have enough babies to replace the population and avoid population collapse. So we can talk about how good that is, if that's the only reason that they're doing it. Next slide. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about some other reaction in Western countries to separatist movements like 4B, but also a more general reaction to feminism and women's non-compliance with male demands for sex and free labor. So there's, on the internet, there's a whole sort of community called the Manosphere, which is a collection of anti-feminist websites and online communities that includes the men's rights movement, incels, pickup artists, and something called Men Going Their Own Way, Magaotao, which is an anti-feminist, misogynistic, mostly online community advocating for men to separate themselves from women and society because they believe society has been corrupted by feminism. So in some ways, I think they see Magaotao as sort of their 4B movement, but it's kind of like, well, gosh, if you're going to separate from us, then we're going to separate from you. And boy, see how you like that. So I think they're maybe not quite getting the point. And also they're very misogynistic and abusive of women online and violent, to the point where actually apparently some of the Magaotao online communities, like on Reddit and some other platforms, have actually been banned, which actually surprises me because usually nothing terrible that men do online is ever banned. But it's actually kind of hard to find some of the materials that were online previously because some of them have been banned, which I guess is a positive thing. So these manosphere groups generally are united in the belief that society, I can't say these things without laughing, is biased against men due to the influence of feminism, and that feminists promote misandry, which is the sort of inverse or the opposite side of the coin of misogyny, which of course they have no political analysis because they don't understand that misogyny is a structural based phenomenon where the reason that it exists, or the way in which it exists, is that men have power over women, and misandry doesn't work that way because women don't have power over men. But they just say, well, anytime women, sort of say anything that is non-compliant with male demands, that's misandry. And acceptance of these ideas is described as taking the red pill, which is a metaphor borrowed from the movie The Matrix. And a very interesting thing, which we don't have time to talk about today, really, but it would be interesting, I think, to have a presentation on this at some point, is that this whole manosphere overlaps very heavily with far-right and alt-right communities. Also in the West, it overlaps with white supremacy and replacement theory, which is this whole white supremacist theory that, dark people are sort of indirectly killing off white people by having too many babies where white people aren't having enough babies, and that we need to repopulate the earth with white people. And people like Elon Musk are sort of trying to do that single-handedly on their own. It's also something that J.D. Vance, replacement theory is something that J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate in the US, has talked about and subscribes to. So there's a lot of overlap between, at least the United States, between this whole manosphere, incel, men's rights movement, and far-right, alt-right communities and white supremacy. So that's fun. Next slide. It's a big soup. Okay, so now we're going to look at a couple of videos that are examples of types of videos that are out there. So there are a lot of videos by men saying, who've heard about the 4B movement, and they're very upset that women are opting out. And so they make all these videos saying that 4B is misandry. And this is sort of a positive thing, because there were a lot of videos like this, but now there seem to be fewer. And I think, again, maybe some of them have been removed. Some of these accounts apparently have been banned, which is actually kind of shocking to me that the men who run these platforms actually care that men are saying misogynistic things, but apparently some of them are being removed. And then there's also kind of a hopeful thing that there's also videos by men who understand why the 4B movement exists and are kind of allies of women who are in the 4B movement, and they try to explain it to other men. So their theme is the 4B movement is part of the decades-long desire by women to live separated from men, and that this is actually a very reasonable desire for women to have. So Joe, if you could click on the Google Drive, we'll look at one example of a very angry man who believes that 4B is misandry. Thank you. So that's an example of the men who are big mad. And he kind of gets it, but he doesn't really get it. But there are some men who do sort of get it. So we're going to now play a video of a man who stitches with this first man. So he plays pieces of the first man's video, and then he explains to men in general, what's really going on and why they're wrong in the way that they look at it. So we're going to go into part 4. We wanted to finish by talking about how all of this relates to past female separatist movements and what some of the similarities across time are. And I think we've decided that we might go over just a few minutes today because we had so much to say. So it's possible we may go over a few minutes. So I will turn it back over to Angela.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to make a couple of points on the latest slide. So first of all, Red Shirt Guy's video, he removed it himself because he had so much backlash from men and from women. I thought that was interesting. The second thing, like generally for me about the good men who seem to get it, I've got always a little bit of a doubt of, are they just pretending because they're really terrified and they're just playing the nice guy and pretending? I'll leave that to you to figure out. And I also find it very interesting that out of all the videos I've looked at a lot of videos, the only one who mentions separatism, the only one who mentions a historical perspective was a man. I thought it was worth pointing, and I wondered why. But we're going to address that because, yes, as Liz said, one aspect of that we thought was really important to include is a historical perspective on separatism, on the 4B movement, but how women have done it. Firstly, because it seems to be lacking, as I said, from the discussion online. As we know, women's history is systematically erased. As we know, every generation has to rediscover our past over and over again. But also because we are always told that separatism is utopian, unrealistic, counterproductive, when in fact, if we look at our history, we hear a different story completely. So this part is going to be about 10 minutes. I think I'm going to speak fast, but I also want to cover it. So please bear with us. I want to briefly talk about 4 historical moments where women have collectively left men and heterosexuality behind. I will share pointers. There will be links for exploring further. And I encourage everybody to go back to the video when it's on YouTube where you can get this information. We can also share the slides if you email WDI. So can I have the next slide, please? So the begins. I want to first say, acknowledge that Aurora, Linnea, and Joe Brew did a very amazing presentation on this very channel a few months ago, and I encourage everybody to see it because it's an hour of absolute amazing radical richness. I'm going to give you 2 minutes of what I gathered. The Begin were a large-scale medieval women's movement that lasted over centuries across Europe. It started in the 11th century, and these women formed autonomous, informal religious communities. They chose to live independently from men, and they rejected both marriage and traditional domestic role and heterosexuality. The Begin provided a radical alternative to the patriarchal structure of the time, offering women a way to live completely outside of male control. And unlike the nuns, Begins were not tied to the church, either financially or spiritually. They also had freedom of movement. And this autonomy allowed them to develop a female-led religious practice, female-centered education, and community work. They also enjoyed economic independence, often thriving through communal living and working, often very successfully. In fact, successfully enough to be a threat to male economy sometimes. And like in the case of marriage resisters and the first wave spinsters, which are my next 2 points, at the time, there was a relative depopulation of men who at that time went abroad to fight the Crusades. And it means that many women had the opportunity to not get married, and to lead a woman-centered independent life away from men. And this life was very popular at the time. Begin communities were huge. They were widespread and influential, with large group of women living in cities like Gwent or Paris. We're talking thousands. It's really, really huge. And Linnea in the presentation described it as a woman's land in every city. That really struck me because I thought it really shows the wonderful scale and radical, nature of this movement that is, I think, widely unknown. And they maintain their independence by passing down property to female relatives or selling it exclusively to other women. Despite facing persecution, including a condemnation by the Pope in 1312 and the execution of many of them as heretics, so they are part of the witch hunt history, the movement persisted for centuries. I think it does represent a significant chapter in women's history and offer a real-life example of resistance to patriarchal control through separatism. So can I please have the next slide? So the second aspect I wanted to talk about were Chinese marriage resisters. Marriage resistors were women in southern China who actively rejected marriage from the mid-19th century to the 1930s, choosing to live independently from men. Many worked in the silk industry, which was one of few sectors that employed women, and that gave them a rare financial independence that women didn't have at the time. They also had unbound feet, contrarily to most of the Chinese female population, because they were considered potential breadwinners, so it would have made no sense for their family to cripple them. And that allowed them both economic and physical freedom to reject marriage, since they didn't have to rely on a husband for their living and support. A major factor enabling this movement was the absence of many men who had immigrated to the US, leaving women free to form strong, supportive communities rather than competing for the few men remaining. I'm sure that's what patriarchy intended, but actually what the women did, it's completely the opposite. This movement grew significantly with an estimate of hundreds of thousands of women at its peak. They are known as the Sworn Sisters of the Golden Orchid or Golden Flower Sisterhood, and these women formed female-only communities, vowing never to marry. The sisterhood provided emotional, social, and economic support, and some women even entered same-sex relationship with ceremonies recognizing union between women. Sworn sisterhood they were not only romantic, they were also built on friendship and organized anti-marriage groups. So you also had collective living as well as couples. Their bonds were so strong that some sisters chose to die together rather than to be forced into marriage. Spiritually, many of these women worshipped Guan Yin, a goddess who had also rejected heterosexual marriage. The marriage resistance movement was not just a personal lifestyle choice, it was a radical political stance against patriarchy, which considers women's role as wives and mother as the only possible option, what we call now compulsory heterosexuality. This mass rejection of marriage, man, and heterosexuality is a powerful form of political resistance, showing that separatism from men is not utopian, but possible and historically real. So I encourage you to go and see the links if you're interested in that. And can I have the next slide, please? Sorry, I got confused in my paper. So the third part is the first wave spinsters. So during the first wave of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th century, the concept of spinster emerged among women. So spinsters, who often defined as unmarried women past the typical marrying age, were frequently marginalized in literature and society. The term carried negative connotation, implying these women were undesirable and had missed their opportunity for marriage, which was seen as women's ultimate fulfillment. They were called redundant or surplus women at the time. High male mortality rate and economic shift meant that the male population was significantly smaller than the female ones. So, however, many women at the time saw this as a blessing and began to embrace their spinsterhood as a form of empowerment. Spinster represented women who consciously rejected societal expectation of marriage, claiming autonomy and independence for themselves. By remaining single, these women escaped male control. They were unmarried, they could live as they wished, earn money, and reject so-called natural duties of womanhood. This became a problem for patriarchy. And this perspective shifted the narrative surrounding unmarried women from one of pity or scorn to one of admiration and respect for their independence. In literature and popular culture started to reflect this trend too, and this gave rise to the new woman movement, which celebrated women independence, career, and aspiration. So rather than being confined to domestic roles, many spinsters became involved in social reform, education, and other professions. Politically and historically, spinsters are tied to the first wave feminist movement and the suffragettes. Beyond the vote, many activists at the time were beginning to develop a critique of heterosexuality through campaigns against marriage, prostitution, or the age of consent, and through writing. You can see Cicely Hamilton, Marriage as a Trade, which you should really read. The movement for women's right to vote was closely linked to this, and because separatist movements are always linked to lesbianism, I think it's worth noting that there were a significant number of lesbians in the women's movement at the time and in spinsters, although lesbian erasure means it is not always acknowledged at first. And on this channel at WDI, you can search up 3 presentations, in fact, one that Liz, you did on the real facts of life by Margaret Jackson that touches on that. And of course, the spinsters and her enemy by Shida Jeffries, who's here today, is discussed twice on this channel as well. And I'll finish with the last slide, please. And here I want to talk about the second wave feminism and lesbians. So in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, as many of you know, because it's something we discuss a lot here, many women distanced themselves from men and heterosexuality as a result of their involvement in the women's liberation movement. So alongside liberal reformists, a radical branch of second-wave feminism emerged, feminist or lesbian separatism. Separatists believed true liberation from patriarchy required a complete separation from men socially, politically, and physically. They argued that patriarchy was too deeply entrenched to change from within, and that women needed space to live and build community free from male influence. So, like Sonia Johnson and others, argued that activism should focus on creating services and solutions for women today, rather than trying to reform a corrupt system based on women hating. Feminist separatists created women-only commune, businesses, festivals to thrive outside patriarchal pressures. This was about more than avoiding relationship with men. It was about rejecting a system that oppressed women. These spaces provided essential environment for consciousness raising, political theory development, and healing from male violence, while also fostering women culture. Critics had argued that separatism didn't account for diverse needs across race, class, sexual orientation, and some said it fostered division. But despite criticism of being unrealistic and woman-hating, again, it is separatist principle that led to the creation of women's gathering, rape crisis centers, and refugees. So for many women in these spaces, the personal became political, leading them to become lesbians despite the patriarchal backlash, denying that this ever happened or even is possible. So I want to say that, to me, throughout all this conversation, the link between separatism and lesbianism is clear. And in the case of spinster and marriage resistance, it is visible. I'm not sure it happened in the beginnings. It probably did, but if anybody had some information, I'll be really interested to read that. But what second wave separatists did and went further, as they theorized sexuality from a feminist perspective, understood heterosexuality as detrimental for women and indeed a cornerstone of women's oppression under patriarchy. They also understood separation from men and lesbianism beyond a mere sexuality as a political mean of liberation for all women. So I'm going to end here. What I'm trying to do with that last slide, I think, and throughout, is to kind of make a bridge between, different generation of women, what's happened, in the past, what's going on now, us. And I really hope that through that conversation and the fact that it's going to be on YouTube, that, there can be new links and women learning from one another.